The night was thick with tension as Bumpy Johnson stood on the corner of 125th Street, his eyes scanning the darkened alleys of Harlem. A cold wind cut through the air, carrying with it the faint scent of danger. It had been years since the NYPD had posed any real threat to him. But tonight, things were different. The cops had begun to circle like sharks, and Bumpy knew they were closing in. Word had spread fast. Bumpy Johnson, the kingpin of Harlem's underworld, had made a fatal mistake. He had crossed the thin line between the criminal world and the law, and now the NYPD was on his tail. It wasn't just a routine bust anymore, it was a full-scale operation to bring him down. The cops had been waiting for an opening, and Bumpy's empire, built on the streets and fueled by drugs, numbers, and control, was a target they couldn't resist. As Bumpy moved through the shadows, his trusted men by his side, he could feel the weight of the city bearing down on him. Harlem had been his for years. He had risen from the streets, built an empire, and commanded respect from the toughest men around. But now, the NYPD had made him public enemy number one. The question wasn't whether Bumpy could survive this. He always survived. It was whether his empire, built on trust, loyalty, and fear, could withstand the weight of the law coming down on him. The sirens screamed in the distance, and Bumpy knew the time had come. He had to make a decision, either turn and fight or disappear into the night. He could already hear the voices of the men who had crossed him, the betrayals and deals gone wrong. It was all coming to a head now, and Bumpy wasn't the type to back down from a fight. The game had changed, and Bumpy was about to play the most dangerous hand of his life. Bumpy Johnson, born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, had seen more than his fair share of hardship before he made his way to Harlem. By the early 1920s, Harlem was alive with opportunity, and it wasn't long before Bumpy's name became synonymous with power. He was more than a gangster. He was a king of the streets. He controlled the numbers racket, the bootlegging business, and had an iron grip on Harlem's criminal underworld. But it wasn't just his ability to make money that earned him respect. It was his skill in navigating the dangerous, shifting alliances between rival gangs, corrupt politicians, and the police. In 1923, Harlem was a powder keg waiting to explode, and Bumpy had his hand on the fuse. His empire wasn't just built on criminal activity, it was built on a delicate balance of power and loyalty. His reputation was as a man who could take what he wanted and keep what was his. His word was law in Harlem, and his control over the streets was unchallenged. But no one is invincible, and even Bumpy Johnson's empire was beginning to show cracks. The NYPD, always looking for a way to increase their power and make a name for themselves, had begun to target Harlem's biggest players, including Bumpy. The city's police force was notorious for its corruption, but even the most crooked cops couldn't ignore Bumpy's influence. His ties to the political machines, his ability to buy off anyone who stood in his way, this had made him a powerful figure, but also a target. The NYPD wasn't interested in Bumpy's business as much as they were interested in taking him down to make an example of him. The time had come for Bumpy to confront the police head-on. But Bumpy wasn't afraid. He had dealt with cops, criminals, and politicians for years. The game, as far as he was concerned, was simple. Stay ahead of the competition, know your enemies, and always have a backup plan. His men were loyal, his streets were under control, and his business was booming. But even Bumpy knew that no empire could last forever, and in 1923, he was about to find out just how dangerous it could be to play the game against the NYPD. The streets of Harlem, with their jazz clubs, speakeasies, and back alley deals, were more than just Bumpy's kingdom. They were a battleground. And now, it was time for the battle that would define the rest of his reign. The NYPD had been tightening the noose around Harlem for months. Under the leadership of Commissioner Rhinelander Waldo, the force had begun a concerted effort to clean up the city's crime-ridden neighborhoods. But Harlem wasn't just any neighborhood, it was Bumpy's territory, and the police's growing interest in taking down the criminal empire only fueled the tension in the streets. Bumpy had long suspected that his activities were being watched closely, but it wasn't until the summer of 1923 that he began to feel the heat. The police had started to hit his businesses, his men, and his trusted lieutenants. They had raided his numbers houses and had even begun questioning his closest allies. But Bumpy wasn't a man to be intimidated by a badge or a uniform. He had survived worse. He had come from the streets, and the streets had taught him how to fight, how to maneuver, how to stay one step ahead. But this was different. The NYPD wasn't just playing the game, they were out for blood. And it wasn't just the police that Bumpy had to worry about. His own men were beginning to show signs of dissent. Trust, something Bumpy had always relied on, was beginning to erode. One of his closest allies, a man named Pete, had started making deals with rival gangs, promising to take Bumpy down in exchange for a piece of his empire. Word had gotten back to Bumpy that Pete had been meeting with the police, feeding them information in exchange for protection. Betrayal, something that could never be tolerated, had entered Bumpy's world, and it was a betrayal that would have deadly consequences. Bumpy had always trusted his men, but now, with the NYPD closing in and his empire under threat, he realized that the game had changed. The streets were no longer his alone. There were new players in the game, and Bumpy had to decide how far he was willing to go to keep his power intact. It was time to send a message. The night of the showdown arrived like a storm, and Bumpy knew it would be a pivotal moment in the battle for his empire. The air was thick with humidity, the streets bathed in the dim glow of streetlights. Harlem was quiet, but the silence was deceptive. A storm was brewing, and Bumpy could feel it in his bones. His empire, built on his fierce will and careful maneuvering, was now at the mercy of the NYPD and traitors within his own ranks. Bumpy wasn't the type to let such things slide. He was about to make a stand, a dramatic stand that would change the course of Harlem's future. His decision was simple. If the police wanted to take him down, they would have to go through him first. But he wasn't about to fight alone. Bumpy had already made arrangements. Word had been sent out, and his loyal men were gathering at his call. But Bumpy wasn't just calling on his crew, he was also setting a trap. Tonight, the NYPD would think they were closing in on a routine bust. What they didn't know was that they were walking into a well-laid snare. Bumpy sat in his office, his eyes narrowed, calculating every move. He wasn't foolish enough to believe that violence was the only way to win this fight. But when the NYPD came knocking on your door, they left you little choice. His men were positioned strategically across Harlem, ready to act at a moment's notice. Bumpy's face was stoic, his mind sharp, but even the slightest flicker of doubt crept into his thoughts. Was he truly prepared to go this far? The sound of a car engine revving outside his office snapped him back into focus. It was time. Outside, the NYPD had set up a perimeter. They had raided several of Bumpy's businesses over the past few days, finding little more than empty rooms and long abandoned warehouses. But tonight, they had a tip, a leak. Someone from within Bumpy's ranks had told them that a major deal was going down. They were on the hunt for Bumpy and his lieutenants. It was supposed to be a simple bust, a clean sweep, but it wouldn't be clean. As the first patrol car pulled up outside, Bumpy's men moved into position. The plan was set. No one would get hurt if it went according to plan, but Bumpy knew the stakes. A fight was inevitable. When the door to his office swung open, Bumpy's Lieutenant Tony stepped inside, his face pale but determined. "The boys are in place, boss. Everything's ready. You know what to do," Tony said, his voice steady but tight with anxiety. Bumpy nodded. He knew what had to be done. He'd been preparing for this day for years, and now it was finally here. He had to protect what was his. But more than that, he had to send a message to the NYPD that Harlem wasn't theirs to control. As the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, Bumpy stood up, adjusting his coat and straightening his tie. He wasn't just Bumpy Johnson, the street king. He was a man with a code, a man who knew the cost of betrayal, and a man who would make the NYPD pay for trying to take him down. "Let's show them what happens when they come for me," Bumpy said, his voice low, filled with the promise of vengeance. The scene erupted into chaos the moment the first cop stepped through the door. Bumpy's men had already taken up their positions, waiting for the signal. The NYPD, expecting a quick arrest, found themselves walking into a trap. Gunfire erupted, the sound deafening in the narrow hallways of the building. But Bumpy's men were ready. They were swift, precise, and brutal. The battle in the heart of Harlem wasn't just about physical combat, it was about power. The NYPD, caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of Bumpy's response, fell back into disarray. Bumpy's men, armed with street knowledge and the will to protect their boss, pushed forward, taking control of the situation. As Bumpy stepped into the fray, the sight of him was like a signal to his men. This was their moment. The fearlessness, the legendary aura that surrounded him, rallied them to stand firm. Bumpy didn't hide in the shadows. He walked through the chaos with purpose, his eyes locked onto the cops who had dared to enter his world. "Get out of my city!" Bumpy shouted, his voice cutting through the gunfire like a blade. "This is Harlem, and you're not welcome here." The NYPD, realizing the full extent of their mistake, tried to regroup, but it was too late. The men, who once walked with confidence through Harlem, now found themselves outmatched and outmanned. Bumpy's crew had turned the tables in an instant, showing the NYPD just how deeply entrenched they were in this city. It wasn't just about the drugs or the rackets, it was about control. By the time the gunfire had subsided and the NYPD retreated, it was clear that Bumpy had won this round. But the victory wasn't without its consequences. Several of Bumpy's men had been wounded, and the message had been sent loud and clear to the NYPD. The streets of Harlem were Bumpy's, and anyone who tried to take them would pay the price. But Bumpy wasn't satisfied with just winning the fight. He wanted to make sure the NYPD knew that this wasn't a game they could keep playing. He wasn't just a king of the streets, he was a force of nature, and Harlem was his kingdom. And in this kingdom, betrayal came with a cost. In the days following the battle, Harlem was alive with the sound of whispers. Word had spread about the confrontation between Bumpy Johnson and the NYPD, and it was clear that the outcome had shifted the balance of power in the streets. The NYPD had lost this battle, but Bumpy's empire had grown stronger. For Bumpy, the immediate aftermath wasn't about celebrating the victory, it was about maintaining control. He knew that his actions would have consequences. The NYPD would regroup, and the fight for Harlem was far from over. But Bumpy's legendary status was solidified that night. He had shown the city, the police, and the people of Harlem that he was not to be underestimated. His power wasn't just in the numbers rackets or the drug deals, it was in his will, his unbreakable grip on the streets, and his ability to strike fear into those who threatened his reign. In the coming years, Bumpy would continue to expand his influence, but the 1923 battle with the NYPD marked a turning point in his legacy. It was the moment when the city knew, without a doubt, that Bumpy Johnson was a man who controlled not just the streets, but the fate of Harlem itself. Bumpy Johnson's rise to power was a story of survival, of fighting for what was his, and of doing whatever it took to hold on to his empire. But it was also a story of respect. A man who understood that to command power, you had to make your presence known, and you had to show the world that you would never back down. The battle with the NYPD wasn't just a fight for control of the streets, it was a fight for the soul of Harlem. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal, he was a symbol, a legend whose name would echo through the streets for years to come. In the world of crime and power, there were no guarantees, but one thing was clear. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was the law. This wasn't just about one man's pride, it was about a community's dignity. In a city where the streets ran red with blood and ambition, Bumpy Johnson stood as a reminder that respect and power were earned, not given. And in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson earned both. Bumpy Johnson's legacy in Harlem was one of fierce independence, unyielding strength, and the indomitable will to survive. He wasn't just a criminal in the eyes of the world, he was a man who had carved out a place for himself in the concrete jungle, where loyalty meant everything and respect was the only currency that mattered. His rise to power wasn't a story of luck, it was a tale of survival, of taking the hardest hits and always coming back stronger. The battle with the NYPD was more than just another conflict in the long history of Harlem's underworld. It was a moment that would define Bumpy's place in the city's history. When the police tried to take Harlem from him, they underestimated the ferocity of the man who ruled it. Bumpy didn't just fight for control, he fought for the respect of his people, for the streets he had built with blood and sweat. In the end, the NYPD didn't just lose a fight, they lost a war for the streets of Harlem, a war that would forever change the power dynamics of the city. Bumpy's victory wasn't about bloodshed, it was about sending a message to everyone who thought they could take what was his. Harlem wasn't just a place to him, it was a kingdom, and he was its king. He had earned that crown, not by playing by anyone's rules, but by making his own. His name was synonymous with power, and in that moment, when the smoke cleared and the last shot was fired, his legend was secured. But like all legends, Bumpy's story wasn't without its cost. The consequences of his actions rippled through Harlem and beyond. He had shown the world that no one could take what he had built, but he had also shown that no empire, no matter how strong, could last forever. The battle with the NYPD was just one chapter in a long story of rise and fall, of loyalty and betrayal, of men who fought for control in a city that never rested. In the end, Bumpy Johnson was more than just a gangster. He was a symbol of resistance, a man who stood tall against the forces that sought to break him. And while his empire may have eventually crumbled, his legacy, like the streets of Harlem, remains unshaken. His name is whispered in the corners of history, a reminder of the man who held the streets with nothing but his wits, his will, and his unrelenting power. This wasn't just about one man's pride. It was about the community's dignity, and in a world where the strong devour the weak, it took a legend like Bumpy Johnson to remind the world what respect truly means. Harlem wasn't just his territory, it was a part of him. And even in the face of all odds, Bumpy Johnson would forever be remembered as the man who never backed down.